What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a lore video about none other than Lucian the Divine. So, with that in mind, Lucian is a main character across the entire plot of the Divinity series, outside of the places he wasn't born yet. So, with that in mind, there are going to be spoilers for several Divinity games. If you don't want those, don't watch the rest of this video, I suppose. Jumping right into it. Now, chronologically, Lucian was actually born sometime after Divinity Original Sin. So that means, in the timeline of things, Dragon Commander and Divinity Original Sin 1 happened first. Lucian wasn't, alive yet. We first see Lucian without actually knowing who he is in Divine Divinity. That is to say, he is the canon protagonist of that game. You actually could pick a few different characters in Divine Divinity, some of them even female. So, with that said, Lucian is the canon protagonist of Divine Divinity. Now that takes place in 1218 AD. We know that Lucian was a grown man by this point, so best case scenario, he was born around 1200 AD would be reasonable to assume because he's just a normal guy at this point. Now, if you're interested in the entirety of the story of Divine Divinity, I do have a story series for that available. If you want to check the link down below, hopefully I've put the link down there. Or just check my channel, I do have a series for that game. That's probably where we have the absolute most amount of information about Lucian because the whole game's about him, really. So at the start of the game, we see members of the Black Ring disrupting what Larian described as a divine being's resting place. And in order to protect itself, this divine being splits into three, goes into three warriors around the realm, and they become Marked Ones. Now this has all kind of been retconned a little with Original Sin 2. The Marked Ones seem to have been changed to Godwoken, and we're not really sure who this divine being was supposed to be that was resting here. It is clearly female, so it would be safe to assume it was maybe one of the female gods, but truth be told, we don't know. And from here, as you might have guessed, Lucian is of course one of these Marked Ones that was marked by this divine being splitting into three. Now throughout the game, we run into Zandalor, who explains to us that we've been marked by a god and have the potential to ascend to divinity. And to do that, we need to restore the Council of Seven, as he tries to find the other two Marked One who also have that potential. So throughout the game, we're kind of working on that while simultaneously fighting the Black Ring and restoring the Council. Now, at some point, it becomes clear that the reason all of this is happening, the reason that divine being was disturbed, is because the Demon of Lies is out in full force. The Demon of Lies is an aspect of the being known as Chaos, which is actually the demon god. I also have videos on that if you would be interested in seeing them. The Demon of Lies has been plotting to do some sort of ritual to bring the full aspect of chaos into the world, because the Demon of Lies is sort of like an avatar for chaos. It's definitely a part of him, they are interconnected. The Demon of Lies is a piece of the demon god Chaos, but he's not the full thing. So he's planning on some ritual to bring the entirety of Chaos's being into Rivellon. And so, of course, the Demon of Lies, actually under the guise of a 12-year-old boy who became the Duke, which is the ruler of this particular realm, has actually been working against you the entire time. However, he fails to actually stop you from ascending to divinity after you successfully restored the Council of Seven. So the Council of Seven is a council with a representative of each race, one including for the wizards, which the member for that race is, of course, Zandalor. So you don't really need to find him, he found you. But once you've assembled these council members, they perform the ritual to help you ascend to divinity. And they succeed in doing so. They manage to get Lucian ascended through this ritual. However, he disappears, and the Demon of Lies attacks and destroys the council pretty much outright, all besides one or two members. And then after this, you get an awesome cutscene where Lucian is being ascended to divinity by the gods as they fill him with divine power. And then you wake up in a desert. And shortly after this, you'll run across Zandalor and Arhu, actually, as well, where it turns out that you have been gone for several months. However, in your absence, the Demon of Lies has actually overrun the kingdom, slaughtered who knows how many people, and has become the dominant power in the realm. and they are very, very close to completing the ritual to summon Chaos into Rivellon. So this is actually the last leg of this particular game, and it is basically a dungeon run, from here to the end, there's a decent amount of content to it, but it's just a slog to the end. Because from here, you get to use your new divine powered up Lucian to fight through enemies until you get to the Demon of Lies, where you can slay him personally. However, Lucian is sadly a little too late. So the ritual the Demon of Lies was trying to perform was to actually instill the soul of chaos into an infant human child. Now, while Lucian was able to interrupt this and keep chaos from being brought in full force into this child, he was unable to stop the ritual from corrupting the child. So it was, however, filled with all of Chaos's evil and hate, shall we say. Now, the ending cutscene in this first game here is actually showing the character struggle with what to do about the child, and then leaving the area with something in his arm, and you couldn't tell if it was like treasure or the baby. Well, we know the answer to this now, and that is that Lucian couldn't bring himself to kill this child. So he decides to take it with him instead and raise it as his own, hoping to purge the evil out of this kid that way. Now, we don't know too much about the next probably 15 or so years because there's no game accounting for it. However, there are some short stories you can read. However, they're not super canonical, though they do kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. What we do know for sure is that at some point in Lucian raising this kid, who he named Damien, Damien meets a woman named Yagurna after joining the Divine Order as a paladin. Yagurna is actually a member of the Black Ring, tasked with showing Damien who he actually is and what he's capable of. Lucian catches wind of this, and is obviously none too pleased, so he has Yagurna executed. And this is probably the beginning of the worst of the troubles. So Damien walks in right as this happens, as Yagurna is executed, and because of this, they actually start a war with each other, basically. So Damien runs off after his father killed his lover, and at the tender age of 15, he commands the Black Ring's forces. He takes up the mantle as their leader, and using their forces, he decides to fight Lucian full on. However, and probably because of the fact that he is Lucian, he manages to trick Damien into following him to a rift temple. And from this temple, Lucian banishes Damien to Nemesis. Nemesis being a separate dimension almost, or like realm. Now this happens in 1233 AD. Now this is incredibly important, and this is where we start getting into major spoiler territory for the more modern games. And that is because Lucian actually uses this as a way to fake his death. And this is also where Lucian ordered Death Fog to be used against all the elves that we hear about in Divinity Original Sin 2. Just jumping ahead a little here, Lucian's plan with faking his death right here was to fake his death, be buried in a tenebrium-laced tomb which would keep the actual gods from sensing where their divine one went, and everyone would think him truly dead. From here, he was planning on draining the actual gods of the rest of their source outside of the power they'd already given him. Because at some point, Lucian realized that the power that they wield is no real life for mortals, and in order to save everyone, he decided to do whatever it was necessary to separate the gods from this power they have over mortals. So basically, Lucian was going to slowly kill them. However, he made a fatal mistake. Fatal probably being a bit of an exaggeration as he doesn't die. But in death fogging all of those elves, he removed worship from Tyr Sindelius, the elven god. This weakens Tyr Sindelius. And because of this, this is actually the first foothold that the Void gets into the world properly. And then from here it kicks off the events of Divinity Original Sin 2, but we'll circle back to that in a little bit. But technically, everything I just mentioned happened in 1233 AD, and I'm trying to do this chronologically. So from here, we don't know much about what happens in the 5 years. We assume people mourn Lucian and his fake death. In 1238, we have the Beyond Divinity game. In this game, while not actually including Lucian directly, it does make mention of him, so I'll just give you a quick plot synopsis. A paladin of the Divine Order is banished to Nemesis, where he is then soul-forged to a Death Knight and must escape by learning how to do things like rift walking by a race called the Renari, who is actually the native resident of the plane of Nemesis. As I've explained in several other lore videos, demons, while they do have a seat of power here in Nemesis, are not actually native to it. Demons come from a realm called Tartarus that was made by Chaos, and they invaded Nemesis and took it over from the race of Renari. Throughout Beyond Divinity, you find a way to learn this magic from the Renari, who are mostly long since dead, and actually escape Nemesis. However, it's revealed at this point that the Death Knight you were forged to was none other than Damien himself. And this whole elaborate scheme was necessary because when Lucian banished Damien to Nemesis, he didn't just banish him there and call it a day. Lucian placed a divine seal around Nemesis that prevented Damien from leaving by any other means than being escorted out by a member of the Divine Order. And because it was a paladin that was banished to Nemesis through this elaborate plot of Damien's, he was able to have himself linked to this paladin and then forge his way out of Nemesis this way, which is how he escaped. Now, I did mention that Lucian is mentioned in this game, and that is true, and it's actually a rather interesting connection. When you get to the end of Beyond Divinity and you're actually learning all this rift running magic, you can talk to the ghost of one of the Renari elders, and he explains in this past version, he's having a past conversation with Damien, because when Damien first came to Nemesis, he was actually taken in by the Renari, who then tried to teach him this rift running thing that they do. Because of the reasons I just mentioned, Damien wasn't actually able to use rift running to just leave of his own accord because of this divine seal that Lucian placed around the place. However, that didn't stop the Renari from investigating why Damien couldn't use it. And in investigating it, the Renari Elder actually managed to speak to Lucian directly, where Lucian actually explained what was going on with Damien to the Renari Elder, which might have proved fatal for that Renari Elder. Because once confronted by this, Damien actually murders the Renari in this temple where he was learning this magic, which is where he more seriously falls in with the demons of Nemesis. But, interestingly enough, this moment where Lucian is talking to this Renari Elder is the only known instance we have of Lucian in between 1233 and 1242, when he was supposedly dead the entire time. Now, 1242 kicks off Divinity Original Sin 2. And while the plot of that game is long and complicated, I've also got a story series for that if you want to watch it. However, we're going to stick to the parts that are Lucian specific. So Lucian, as I'd mentioned earlier, had been draining the gods of power after faking his death in 1233 to purge the world of Source. So at some point he was contacted by a woman named Dallas, who actually was an Eternal, the Eternal being the very first race of the world, it would seem, who then later became the gods through a bunch of drama around Divinity Original Sin 2. But as the plot of Divinity Original Sin 2 tells you, that Lucian wasn't aware that death fogging all of these elves was actually going to weaken Tyr Sindelius and allow the void in. However, coincidentally, Lucian's plan to purge the world of Source, which he had originally done all of this for, was actually the solution to the void, because purging the world of Source would allow them to restore it to the Veil, and thus reinstate the barrier between the void and Rivellon. Now, while we cannot be sure, there's a lot going on in Divinity Original Sin 2, it is presumed that the canonical ending of that game is that the world was purged of Source like Lucian wanted. While we can't be sure of that 100% because of the events of Divinity 2, which takes place about 60 years later from this, it's almost guaranteed that the world was either purged of Source or it was shared with everyone. And some of the marketing for the put on hiatus game of Divinity Fallen Heroes specifically mentions that it takes place in a purged world. So because of that, I think it's fairly safe to say that the canonical ending for DOS 2 is very much so probably that the world was purged of Source. Which brings us to Fallen Heroes. So while we don't know much about the game, we know it's supposed to take place 2 years after DOS 2 in 1244 AD. We know that Lucian survives this. We knew that before Divinity Original Sin 2, actually, because Lucian is in Divinity 2, which I'll get to in a bit. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Lucian is actually fake assassinated somewhere around this time. We just don't know the exact circumstances. We know this because we're told this in Divinity 2, and we verify it in that game. At some point in between Divinity Original Sin 2 and, after Fallen Heroes, of course, as well, and probably about 1250, 1260 AD, roughly, Lucian is fake assassinated by a Dragon Knight. A Dragon Knight that was actually mind-controlled by none other than Damien, who has just been biding his time since he escaped Nemesis in 1238. So Damien somehow mind-controls a Dragon Knight to fake assassinate Lucian, and everyone turns on Dragon Knights, presumably the only real force left in the world that's like super powerful after the world is presumably purged. Because without sorcerers, you pretty much just have regular old magic, and decoupled from source isn't as powerful, which make Dragon Knights kind of like the be-all, end-all of warriors these days. The world turns on them, and there's not a lot of them to begin with, so they can't withstand that onslaught, so to speak, and they eventually crumble. And Divinity 2 is otherwise known as the Dragon Knight Saga. It takes place in 1300 AD. Now, sticking to specifically what involves Lucian here, we find out after the game ends, Divinity 2 that is, which takes place in 1300 AD, that Lucian is actually alive. Damien has kept him alive and trapped in a place called Hypnerotomachia, which is like a place outside of time. For like the last 40, 50 years, we don't know exactly when, but he's been dead a hot minute, supposedly dead. The expansion to Divinity 2, Flames of Vengeance, is actually all about freeing Lucian from Hypnerotomachia and stopping Damien's machinations, because after all that time, after escaping Nemesis in 1238, Damien finally decided to make his move. And Divinity 2 is all about you being the last Dragon Knight, staving off as much of Damien's advance as possible, and that comes to a head after your Dragon Knight travels to the Hall of Echoes, which is the afterlife, in an effort to revive Yagurna, thinking it was actually going to kill Damien if he did so. However, it was actually a trap, because then your character becomes trapped in Hypnerotomachia as well with Lucian, and that's the end of the original Divinity 2. And then they release the expansion. Now, you get freed by a mage who's actually looking for some help because he traveled to you in spirit form, and says if you free him, or if he frees you rather, and come free him, he can help you free Lucian here. Which is the plot of Flames of Vengeance, really. You are in a city that is besieged by Damien's forces as he's quickly trying to take over what's left of Rivellon. And ultimately, you manage to push him back, of course, but not Damien specifically. As I mentioned, you resurrected Yagurna, and she is actually the person in charge of these assaults, and you do wind up killing her as a result of the final battle of Flames of Vengeance. So, that leaves us with Lucian being freed after Yagurna is killed. However, it also leaves Damien alive. So that's the end of what we know about Lucian's life so far. At the end of 1300 AD, which is the most recent game chronologically in the Divinity series, Lucian is alive and well, but so is Damien, his wayward son. There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed this lore video about Lucian the Divine and as much information as I could gather about him and some other stuff. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.